Greetings, friend, and welcome to the Between the Covers podcast, where we are working every day to remove the self-limiting beliefs that are preventing us from becoming the heroes of our own stories. I am Marcus Spar, and before we jump into a re-look at the topic of trauma, I do just want to remind you that if you are enjoying this podcast, then I'd greatly appreciate it. If you are listening on Spotify or on iTunes, to please give the podcast a 5-star rating. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then please subscribe, give the video a like, leave a comment. And again, you can also send me any questions or topic suggestions or individuals that we could interview for future hero study. You can email me at questions.btcpod@gmail.com. Now, we have already talked in a much earlier episode about trauma. And this is something that is worth coming back to because I have learned quite a bit about trauma in my own research, listening to experts in this area. And there are some things that I realized don't exactly align too much anymore with what I had said back then. Probably the biggest thing is how when I first started this work, I learned about trauma through the lens of little t trauma and big T trauma. And just a quick reminder, big T trauma is something like witnessing a violent crime or going to war, having a horrific loss in your family, and the little t trauma was always described as little bits of trauma that happen over a long period of time, something akin to neglect or bullying or the like. However, it's much more nuanced than that. I heard on the Sunday School Dropouts podcast with Dr. Laura Anderson and Andrew Curbs. It's also something I've heard in the Neurosomatic Intelligence podcast that I listen to, that trauma is typically looked at through the lens of whether it's complex trauma, typically through like post-traumatic stress versus complex post-traumatic stress. Now, I do just want to specify I'm not an expert in this area by any means. I am still learning and growing in what it is to define and work with trauma. However, instead of looking at this very simplistic view of trauma that it's either a big event or it's a lot of small events that build up to someone having an experience with trauma, it's so much more dynamic and complex than any of that. And there is a great example of this that came up where Libby and I last night, as we were winding down for the night, she was telling me that she was struggling with some very difficult thoughts and feelings regarding some of our friends. And some of these thoughts came from her very narrow upbringing in the Catholic tradition. Well, not just Catholic tradition, it was also, I think, Lutheran, but the evangelical or just conservative Christian perspective. And what had happened is there were some thoughts that came up in her mind where it started to make her question some of the activities of our friends. And because of that, she was very distraught and she was so full of shame because of it. And she honestly didn't know where this was coming from, for one thing, which oftentimes is the case. These things occur, they happened a long time ago in our past, and we just have these automatic responses that kind of dictate how we act. And it's a lot of times just ways to cope with or escape from the trauma. So she was really wrestling with some difficult thoughts, and this is something she had been mulling over these thoughts for hours at this point. And then she's like, okay, I really want to talk with you about something. And we started talking and processing. And just by creating a space for her to process, to think, to look at things from different perspectives, she had shared that these shameful messages that were coming up in her mind were ones that she had experienced when she was very young from the Christian teachings that she had learned at a young age. Now, she still identifies as a Christian. She doesn't identify as an American Christian, and she has much more open views on a lot of the social dynamics of our day and age. Yet, this was something that was causing some incredible distress in her just last night. We were working through not necessarily something that could be classified as post-traumatic stress, but it was definitely complex. The complexities of what was causing the shame, what was causing the thoughts that were leading to the feelings that she was experiencing. It's so much more nuanced than saying, okay, one big thing happened in her life, or it was just a lot of smaller things that happened. In the end, she was experiencing trauma in that moment. Now, this is another thing that makes trauma complex, because there are a lot of people out there that, had they gone through the same thing, wouldn't have been that big of a deal. They would have just been able to brush it off, or even as a young kid, just accept whatever it is and move on with their day and not have anything of concern that they would need to address later on in life. Because we all experience trauma in unique ways. Again, we are all unique, our stories are unique, and our responses and how our body reacts to these traumatic experiences makes it very difficult to just make a nice, easy compartment and say, this is how you experience trauma. In fact, I've even heard that with the DSM-5, that they do have a very specific definition of what trauma is. And while a lot of people are wanting to broaden that definition, where did I hear this from? Maybe it even was on the Sunday School Dropouts podcast or the neurosomatic intelligence. But what was said is that if we change the definition of what trauma is to this newer, broader definition, then that means everyone's going to have trauma. And for individuals like doctors, and as much as I hate to say it, I'm guessing even individuals in the insurance agencies who are coming up with the diagnostic criteria in these medical books, that would be a problem, because then that would mean that they would need to provide the appropriate services to everyone. And it also shows how really we all have trauma. We all have some form of trauma in our past. And right now, in the United States, the shit just continues to hit the fan. And 2025 has been a very, very challenging year for a lot of not just Americans, but people throughout the world. With the back and forth of Trump's tariffs, with threats of violence, with, God, just recently there were military strikes in another country. There are people who are legitimately concerned that something like World War III is going to happen. And I'm not here to say whether or not that actually is going to take place. But there's so much insecurity and uncertainty. And we have people who are democratic, people who are individuals of color, people who believe in other religious practices from what the conservative right is telling us is proper, who are being detained, who are being arrested, who are being threatened. As a nation, there are a lot of us who are going through trauma. These are traumatic events. I find myself more and more just being exhausted because it is every fucking day there is something new going on. And it feels like every single day we're just drinking from a fire hose in terms of trauma. And Libby has been doing a program to help her with some weight loss goals that she has. And she was telling me last night, this is her second time going through this program, and her progress has not been to the same level that she had hoped. And even compared to the first time going through this program, she has made pretty much consistent progress every week, but it has been at a rate of just losing like maybe half a pound or something in a week, which isn't bad by any means. But she was hoping for more. And as we were talking about some of the dynamics with these, just with the political landscape, with her progress and the goals that she's working to achieve in her program here, there was something that came up where she said that she feels like she is constantly in that survival state of mind. And that kind of makes sense. If you're in a program that is telling you that you need to operate at a caloric deficit, then your body's going to respond as if you're possibly in some kind of a famine state. And that's something that is going to trigger survival mechanisms. And while she had the best of intentions, and I know that she was really hoping to make some good progress, maybe we just need to honor that the progress that she has made over these last 7 weeks or so, maybe the fact that she's made progress in the right direction, considering she is not just operating at a caloric deficit, but she's operating at heightened anxiety and feeling very insecure. I mean, I have made comments to Libby that I would love to get an ally flag to hang from our house. And whenever I bring that up, it's something that she's very concerned about, because we do have a lot of MAGA people over here. And we don't know how they're going to respond. And yet I also want to just put out there that this is a safe place, that our home is a safe place for people. And it's hard to find that balance. It is really hard to find that balance of, especially in this day and age, of how do I let people know that you're safe here, that we are advocates and allies, and yet also not put a target on our backs that denote that there is something inherently wrong with us, that we're not American enough, we're not true Americans. And to not create more stress and trauma in our day-to-day lives. If you're trying to make progress on something, whether we're talking progress in mental health, progress in fitness or weight loss, progress toward some kind of creative objective that you have, say that it's a painting, say that it's poetry, some other kind of written art, some other kind of physical or visual art. Maybe you're trying to perform. Maybe you're trying to learn a new instrument, whatever it is. If it seems like it is harder to do, or you're just not finding the time and the energy, or maybe you have the time, but you don't have the energy, or when you have the energy, you don't have the time, there's a good chance that what's going on here is that there is some lasting trauma that is connecting to experiences in your past. With some of the work that I've done with the inner child recovery process, and I was telling this to Libby last night as we were having our conversation, is our brains are really good at taking experiences that are happening now and connecting them to experiences in our past. And our brains say, this is the exact same thing. It's often described as an inner child within you, but there is an inner child that says what is happening now is the same as what's happened in the past. Therefore, we need to turn to the coping mechanisms that have helped us in the past. If we actually take a look at these claims with scrutiny, we will end up discovering that in most cases, it's not exactly the same. There are many differences, and our brains are very good at what science would call selection bias. And that is where you are only looking at evidence that supports what you're looking for, and you disregard evidence that doesn't support it. We are very good at that as humans. We are very good at finding what we're looking for. If you are looking for evidence that supports what you think to be true and what you believe to be true, you're going to find it. You will find that evidence. You might not realize that you're sifting through a mountain of evidence that contradicts it, but once you have the evidence that proves it, then that makes it true. This is something that we can do through our trauma as well. If you have a belief that you're not good enough, well, then you're going to find a lot of evidence that tells you that you're not good enough. If you believe that no one cares what you have to think or what you have to say, then you're going to find so many examples where people are talking over you, or you can't even get a word in edgewise. If you believe that the work ahead of you is going to be very challenging and difficult, not to say that it isn't going to be, but our brains will tend to make that even more difficult than it needs to be. Your trauma, and my trauma, honestly, is really great at creating self-fulfilling prophecies, because we will find ourselves stuck in a routine of doing the same things over and over again. I think of the example of someone who is in a traumatic relationship with someone, and they have a partner who is belittling, who is just not treating them very well. And even though everyone around them says, get rid of that person is terrible for you, they keep going back to that person, or they find someone else who is like that person, because that is the pattern. That is what the brain is used to, and it's following that pattern of trauma. I could be totally off base on this. However, this is something I have seen many, many times in the past. I have seen it in my own life. It's why I have to be so careful about my own coping mechanisms. If I find myself wanting to return to my typical coping mechanisms, I have to examine why. And what is it trying to do for me? How is it trying to help? And where am I experiencing things that are similar to experiences I've had in my past? If I find that, then I've found where my trauma is coming in and saying, hey, we got to do this thing in order to feel better, to run away from the feelings. And that's not helping us. At a time it did. But again, our trauma is so complex. It's nuanced to each individual experience. And we'll see what comes up as people continue to dive into trauma and mental health and just the complexities of each individual experience and how they are learning to deal with very difficult and challenging situations in their lives. And if you are experiencing something akin to trauma, then please find help. Seriously. Find someone that you can talk to. Find someone who can support you. I am happy to have a call with you and see if there is a way that I can support you. There are so many people out there, coaches and therapists and counselors alike, who want to help you thrive instead of just survive. Find those who can help you. And always remember, you are worth it. You are worth the effort. You are worth the investment. And until next time, live strong for today.